Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 8, which has to do with the establishment of the new republic in the 1790s. And of course, this chapter is a follow-on to the experiments that we witnessed at the state level and then at the national level in terms of creating both state constitutions and then a federal constitution that was deemed to be more effective, or I should say more effectively designed at the time than the Articles of Confederation. Now, before we get into the actual details of Chapter 8, it's important to realize that when we talk about the United States, and specifically when we talk about this book and its discussion of the United States, the dominant theme is one of invention, innovation. It's the reason that the book is titled Inventing America. And of course, we've seen this throughout the colonial period, where the book chronicled various experiments in how to live in the New World. And of course, in the last two chapters, both Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, we also saw this theme of innovation when it came to the creation of state and then the federal constitution. And so this theme is going to be carried through again in Chapter 8 and in subsequent chapters. The idea of experimentation, the idea of inventing the country. We had a blueprint with the federal constitution, but the question of the 1790s will become how to interpret that blueprint and how to establish a republic that ideally will protect notions of freedom and democracy. Of course, another thing that the book does in Chapter 8, about halfway through, is it focuses on things that are happening throughout the national economy during the time of the 1790s. And of course, it's important to realize that a lot of the innovations of the United States do not come at the federal level or at the city of Washington, D.C., once it becomes the capital, but instead are happening throughout the country and oftentimes have a direct influence on what is happening in the nation's capital. And so it's important to kind of always seesaw back and forth between our obsession with what is going on politically in the nation's capital with what is also taking place out in the country at large. So as we turn our attention to Chapter 8, it's important to begin with this idea that essentially, while we had this blueprint of the federal constitution, we did not have a clear understanding of how this would work in day-to-day practice. And what we will see is that some of the political rituals will need to be created almost whole cloth by the Washington administration in order to kind of give American governance a kind of distinct feel and most importantly, a very practical feel. I mean, the government had to work. It couldn't just look good on paper. It actually had to function. And of course, this is going to be one of the primary tasks. And of course, in the background is this obsession with trying to make sure that we don't simply copy British traditions, because after all, we had a number of disagreements with Britain during the time of the Revolution, and the notion of copying their way of doing business would be a very controversial issue in the 1790s. Ultimately, it's important to realize that in the 1790s we begin to see that the executive is a very powerful feature of the new republic. And what I mean by executive is, of course, the president. The president is a very powerful person in our government, even from the beginning. And this is understood, especially when one considers the innovation that takes place in the executive branch, particularly when Washington helps to develop this idea of a cabinet, and that the Senate acquiesces to this cabinet creation and simply insists on, this will be James Madison insisting on this, that the Senate have the ability to approve who is in the cabinet, this group of advisors to the president, that the Senate will approve those who are appointed to these cabinet positions, but of course leave to the president the power to dismiss cabinet officials. This will be important later on in American history, particularly when it comes to the first impeachment proceedings against Andrew Johnson following the Civil War, whether the president really actually has this power to dismiss cabinet officials without the approval of the Senate. At the beginning, the argument was that he did. And the notion is that the president is not only in a position to set up a group of advisors, the cabinet, for himself, but he's also empowered with the ability to appoint people to the federal bureaucracy, which becomes an extremely important form of political power, the idea of appointing people to government jobs. This will eventually become known in American history as the spoils system. The idea being that to the victor goes the spoils, that you get to put your friends into government if you win elections. And so this is the beginning of a lot of the power that the presidency still has to this day, even though we will see later on after the Civil War the introduction of civil service requirements. By and large, the idea is that the president gets to have pretty broad power in selecting who will help him to administer the executive branch. Another element that should be discussed here before passing on is the idea that the new republic will establish a post office. And the post office is important because it's going to be one of the first major ways of tying the country together, of making sure that there's a real distribution of information, which of course, if you'll recall, was very important to the Revolutionary period, the idea of getting information around the colonies. Now, of course, the United States is trying to improve upon that with a system of postal service. And of course, it's supposed to be relatively independent, meaning that the mail is not to be tampered with or censored by the government. It's supposed to be a fairly independent agency. This does not always happen according to plan. In fact, we'll see that during the time of the crisis over slavery prior to the Civil War, the South will actually tamper with the mail quite a bit in an effort to prohibit abolitionist literature from getting into the South. So the post office is far from perfect, but the idea is one that is very small r Republican and Democratic. The idea that the mail should be this free flow of information. Of course, another big piece of business for the early government was to set up a judiciary. And of course, the judiciary was supposed to act as, basically an interpreter of the laws, both at the local and state level, and then, of course, ultimately at the federal level. Now, it will take a while before the federal judiciary really has the power to interpret whether a law is constitutional. We'll see this later on in Marbury versus Madison. But by and large, the court system that's established by the Congress is given the power to basically ensure that that law and order is a sacred concept in America. And of course, at the federal level, eventually the judiciary will become a very, very important branch of the government. Some might even argue the most important branch by the time we get past Marbury versus Madison in 1803. Of course, another element here is the establishment of the Justice Department and the Attorney General, a cabinet position, and the kind of fleshing out by the government of what constitutes the crime of treason. And this will be done through a Punishment of Crimes Act, all of which are important things that will have a bearing on future controversies in American history. Of course, the biggest work of the original Congress of the New Republic was the creation of a Bill of Rights. Now, most of us think we understand kind of the history of the Bill of Rights, that it was tacked on to the Constitution in order to ensure ratification. And there's really nothing wrong with understanding that. But we can go deeper. We can understand that there was quite a controversy over even the need for a Bill of Rights. James Madison argued that a Bill of Rights is actually redundant. I mean, if the people retain sovereignty under the Constitution, why is it that you would need a separate document or a separate set of amendments to basically repeat the idea that the people have power and that the government is not absolute in its power? Nonetheless, there will be others, Jefferson among them, who will argue that a Bill of Rights actually becomes a very useful thing because it becomes something that the courts can use to, very actively protect the rights of individuals, the people themselves. And in fact, that really is the legacy of having a Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights becomes one of the things that the courts routinely will turn to in order to basically guarantee that the rights of the people are assured. The fact that they're very specific and the fact that they can be understood typically in a rather straightforward fashion means that the courts will have tremendous power in terms of guaranteeing the rights and the liberties of the American people. And of course, the addition of a Bill of Rights, it was originally proposed 12 amendments, becomes 10 amendments. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution will be the thing that will help get the Constitution ratified when you consider states such as North Carolina and Rhode Island. And of course, later on, we'll see with the addition of Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee coming into the Union under this new constitutional order with a Bill of Rights. Now, perhaps the most important cabinet figure early on is not Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State. It's Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury. And it's very important to wrap your mind around what Hamilton's thoughts were in terms of establishing America as a mercantile and commercial empire. Or I should say, perhaps empire's a little grandiose, a commercial and mercantile power in the world. By and large, one of the things that Hamilton was most concerned about was the idea of debts at the state level left over from the Revolutionary War. And he wanted to assume these states' debts so that they could be collected into a national debt. And then, of course, a national debt could be managed by a government that Hamilton was actually pretty pleased with in terms of its power and wanted to increase its power. So once you have assumed the state debts, you're giving the government quite a bit of power because it's going to have to manage quite a bit of money. And of course, the way that you manage that money is to establish something that will be argued over as to whether it is constitutional or not, and that is a national bank. Hamilton will argue that it is constitutional, that it falls under the so-called elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause. Of course, Jefferson and Madison will argue that the national bank is unconstitutional, and that will be one of the great first political divides. Of course, there was also, this argument over state debts and the assumption of state debts at the national level. It was the case that the South, by and large, which is where the war went last, had incurred the least state debt in terms of the Revolutionary War, whereas if you looked at the North, they had accrued an enormous amount of debt because that's, of course, the seedbed of revolution. Think about Boston, Massachusetts. When the state debts become assumed at the national level, what you effectively have is everybody kind of putting that debt together and paying it off equally, or you might argue unequally, because after all, the southern states had already cleared their debts from the Revolutionary War for the most part, and here they were kind of burdened up with the debt from the northern states. This suited Hamilton just fine because, after all, he was very much in favor of the North kind of being freed up so that it could pursue all kinds of mercantile trade. And so the notion that the North would kind of get a little bit of a free pass when it came to dealing with the debt situation, that was just fine. And then the fact that a lot of investors in the National Bank would be Northerners and wealthy foreigners too, including wealthy British foreigners, that suited Hamilton just fine too, because after all, he looked to Britain for inspiration in terms of its banking system, its commercial system. Hamilton has even been referred to as a neo-mercantilist, which is kind of backtracking on a little bit of the free trade rhetoric that came out of the Revolution. Hamilton, of course, had other ambitious plans for the government. In addition to assuming the state debts and creating a national bank, he wanted to erect tariffs to protect American manufacturers, and he actually wanted to encourage manufacturers. In fact, there was a company that was established known as the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures, known as the SUM. And the SUM, of course, was basically a federal project to try and stimulate the economy. Hamilton was all over this. He thought this was a great thing. He was instrumental in establishing it. Of course, it actually represents one of the great failures early on in Hamilton's vision, because the SUM does not take off. It actually goes bankrupt. But it is part of this larger ambitious plan to use federal power to basically engineer a modern economy, which is kind of what Hamiltonianism was. Of course, Jefferson, tried to react to this and to get some concessions, but about all he was able to get was the idea that the capital would be based in the South, Washington, D.C., and Virginia. So Jefferson, who was against this idea of the federal government getting all this power through Hamilton's financial programs, essentially got outfoxed, and about the only thing he came away with was, of course, the capital being placed in Virginia. This will be one of the things that really drives Jefferson into the opposition, because, of course, Washington will be backing his Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, all the way, and Jefferson will really feel left out. Now, if we look at the middle section of this chapter, we see that essentially after the very troubled, critical period of the 1780s, that in the 1790s, a lot of things spring to life, economically speaking. Boston and other port areas will become very, very important. And of course, we will see that there is an explosive increase in wealth, that trade really takes off. Not only will we see shipbuilding take off, but we will see, just generally speaking, improvements in the market economy. And what we mean by market economy is, by and large, a free trade economy. And this is something that will really come to define the United States. It will become, very much what it was, some would say, destined to become, which is a very big trading empire in the Atlantic world. And of course, it's an innovative country as well. You have the development of unique innovations such as sea clocks or chronometers, a reflecting quadrant, and even the publication of a national almanac by Nathaniel Bowditch that will, basically signal to the world that America is this very innovative place, this very free trade area of the globe in which a lot of things are happening. And this will help to pull in a lot of investment. So it wasn't just Hamilton in his stimulative efforts with the national government. It was also a lot of local efforts that helped to encourage this, a lot of local trading efforts. It should be mentioned that another thing that Bowditch was responsible for was the publication of something known as the New American Practical Navigator, which became one of the great handbooks of essentially navigation. And so again, not only do you see the economic growth of the United States, but you also see this contribution to the sciences and to industry and technical expertise, and that will become very, very important. Of course, America will also be defined, as it had been throughout the colonial period, by its raw materials: rice, tobacco, wheat, and of course cotton. Cotton will eventually come online in the South. It will be a much better replacement for tobacco production, particularly in areas of the Deep South. There will be, essentially a replacement of the long staple cotton by the short staple green seeded cotton that will come to define the American industry. And by the time Eli Whitney, another great innovator, comes up with the cotton gin, you will see that within a generation the American South became the world's predominant producer of raw cotton. And this will be absolutely transformative of the region, because the South will accrue wealth that previously had been somewhat limited. Now all of a sudden we will get the great cotton crop developing massive fortunes. And of course, let's not forget that slavery is going to become hardwired into the Southern experience. Remember, the founders were kind of shameful about slavery. People like Jefferson, Washington, they found slavery to be a despicable institution. Doesn't mean that they did much about it. I mean, Washington did free his slaves upon his death, but they were not proud of it. Once you get the introduction of cotton and you begin to see that the Southern economy becomes hardwired into its production, you'll see that it shackled the region to slave labor, and it changed the relationship among white Southerners in ways that would have unforeseen consequences. That's a quote from a book that is a great foreshadowing of things to come. The South, because they are successful with slavery and cotton, will become quite proud of slavery and cotton, and will begin to make positive arguments about slavery and cotton. That this is, essentially a great thing to have this system in place in the South. And of course, that will lead to some really defensive actions taken by Southerners in the run-up to the Civil War. And this, of course, has enormous consequence for American history. Nonetheless, the argument in the 1790s when we talk politics was not about, the South and the North. It was not about slavery. It was about other issues that you could say related to all that stuff later on, but by and large had to do with what kind of government we were going to establish. And was this national government going to be a very powerful government, or was it going to be limited in its scope? The Federalists were in favor of power. These are the people who had supported Hamilton's financial program. The Democratic Republicans, as they will become known, will be people like Madison and Jefferson, and they will be kind of in the opposition in the 1790s, fighting against what they believe is the power grab of the Federalists. Both of these groups, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, believed that they were essentially defending what the Revolution was fought for. And that is a critical idea in American history. This notion of what did we fight for? What was the Revolution all about? What kind of government should we have? Right? What should shape our national identity? This is critically important. And the idea that American politics can be seized by this kind of revolutionary fervor, this idea of protecting the revolution, explains some of the hyper-partisanship that we see, say, in the 1790s, but perhaps that we also see in our own time today, this notion that somehow the idea of the founding has to be protected, that the revolution, must be protected. That will really drive a lot of the intensity. And of course, you see it reflected in the popular press of the 1790s. You have John Fenno's Gazette of the United States, which defended the Federalist position. These are great primary sources to look at when looking at the Federalists. And then, of course, you have the National Gazette, edited by the poet Philip Freneau, who was an admirer of Jefferson. So you have Fenno and Freno, and you have the Gazette and the National Gazette, and all these kind of papers trading back and forth that kind of remind you a little bit of what we might see with maybe some of the cable news outlets and other forms of press, blogs and other things in our own time. So you have this great press war that breaks out on these political issues. And of course, one of the things that was very controversial was this tax that was placed on whiskey. Hamilton had a way of basically dealing with the debts, and it was to not only introduce the national bank, which would allow for some level of private investment, both from domestic and foreign sources, but also needed some revenues. Some of the revenues could come from perhaps tariffs, but a lot of the revenues had to come from in the form of internal taxes. Now, internal taxes are a dangerous thing in America because, of course, we had the Stamp Act was an internal tax imposed by the British, and see where that got them. Here you have Hamilton basically signing off on the idea of a whiskey tax. Now, the whiskey tax was something that fell on Westerners and even Southerners, but almost certainly didn't fall on Northeasterners. And remember, Hamilton is really trying to rig the game for the Northeasterners. He thinks that that will help stimulate a modern economy and help develop the United States into a mercantile and commercial powerhouse in the world. So we get this tax on whiskey. And of course, because the whiskey taxes seem to be so terribly unfair, in the sense that it comes on the backs of the poor, you might say, the poor frontiersmen. A lot of the folks that had fought the Revolutionary War were now being taxed. You have this whiskey rebellion that takes place. Of course, Washington, who is on the side of Hamilton, makes very quick work of the whiskey rebellion. The Militia Act is passed with the Federalists in Congress, and essentially, a larger army than what we had under Washington's command in the Revolutionary War is sent out to western Pennsylvania and put down the whiskey rebellion, and it is done in pretty short order. And it kind of goes to show that, whoa, the federal government really does have some teeth. I mean, this is something that we probably wouldn't have had with the Articles of Confederation. Remember, Shays' Rebellion was put down by local militia in Massachusetts, not by the federal government. So here we have the federal government with an awesome display of power, essentially, putting down the whiskey rebellion. Now, it is true that Washington will pardon most of the whiskey rebels, but the display of force had been done. Other things that divided people politically during the 1790s would be, of course, the problems going on between France, which had undergone revolution in 1789 and was in the period of the Directory, and a lot of the bloodletting of the 1790s. And of course, the great rival of France, who is very worried about the revolution and where it's headed, and that, of course, would be Britain. It's generally an okay rule to say that the Federalists were on the side of Britain and that the Democratic Republicans were on the side of France, but nobody looked too good here. I mean, after all, Britain had been one of our former adversaries, and France was really becoming quite chaotic. And neither seemed to be too respectful of the United States. You had, of course, the British Orders in Council, which led to the impressment of American sailors, which means that they were taken from their ships and impressed into the British military. And then, of course, you had on the French side Edmond Guinet's very ludicrous tour, where essentially he thought that by touring the United States that he would be able to tell Washington what to do with respect to his foreign policy concerning France. These things really left a bad taste in the mouths of the partisans of the 1790s. So if you were against the British, you had plenty to fight over. And if you were against the French, you had plenty to fight over. And generally speaking, the Federalists were revolted by the chaos of France, and the Democratic Republicans were absolutely revolted by what they thought is the monarchialism of the British. And so this is really quite a contest. Lost in the shuffle, of course, will be a situation in Haiti that eventually will grow into a full-scale rebellion or revolution, Toussaint Louverture, by the time that Jefferson will be president. And of course, this will be kind of overlooked. This slave rebellion that takes place in Haiti, not really dealt with adequately, you might say, by their Democratic Republican leadership to the north, the United States. In fact, Haiti will be largely ignored, and folks in the United States will look the other way when it comes to their reconquest by the French. Nonetheless, we do have other issues that will cause problems. We have westward expansion, which will allow for a great discussion of where the country is headed. And you have the Battle of Fallen Timbers and the Treaty of Grenville, which will really open up the Northwest in terms of expansion. This will be fought over by the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans over what the priorities of the United States should be. You have Jay's Treaty, which was drawn up with the Washington administration with respect to Great Britain. And of course, Jay's Treaty was hated by Democratic Republicans who felt that one of the greatest issues against the British, the problem of impressment, was not adequately dealt with. And so, the Democratic Republicans will really have a field day going after Washington getting taken on Jay's Treaty with Britain. Of course, you have, pardon me, you have, Jefferson's idea that the Jay's Treaty was a real betrayal, but you also have this idea that Washington has that by and large we should avoid any real taking of sides, this idea of neutrality, and so that may explain why Jay's Treaty was kind of hammered out in the way it was. It was a way to really avoid conflict with the British, not so much to get concessions. And of course we also have Pinckney's Treaty with the Spanish, which was a major accomplishment of the Washington administration because it allowed for us to use the port of New Orleans in order to get our trade out from the Middle West and the Mississippi. So issues back and forth. You have the foreign issues, France and Britain. Of course, you have domestic issues, the Whiskey Rebellion, Hamilton's financial program. All these things are going to be critical in kind of intensifying the political separation. But of course, things will become really, really intense under the second president of the United States, under John Adams. And John Adams will essentially be someone that is unable to really manage all the political factions that have developed in the country. He is not really loved by the Federalists because he's not really interested in going to war with France. There is what is known as a quasi-war, and Adams will sign off on a series of half measures to deal with the problem of France, particularly after the XYZ affair, when French diplomats are really disrespectful to Americans. And so we will have this naval program, but of course the thing that really sticks in the craw is the Alien Sedition Acts. These were all kind of half measures taken to avoid war with France, which upsets the Federalists. And yet at the same time, because of these half measures, particularly the Alien Sedition Acts, you will have the Democratic Republicans become very, very upset with Adams. And rightfully so, because the Alien Sedition Acts essentially made massive restrictions on foreigners coming into the country, the thought being that they might spread the terror of the French Revolution. But on top of that, you have the Sedition Act, which was this notion that you couldn't freely criticize the government of the United States, that they were dealing with this crisis with France, and therefore there shouldn't be this political opposition kind of cutting away at the administration. And of course, this leads to Democratic Republican newspaper editors like Matthew Lyon, or I should say, Congressman Matthew Lyon, who was, of course, featured heavily in the press, being thrown into jail. And of course, this will be a situation where, ultimately Jefferson and Madison, who are kind of the really big figures of the Democratic Republicans, will come up with what are known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which are very, very interesting resolutions because they essentially articulate the idea of nullification, that if states feel that the federal government has crossed constitutional boundaries, that the states have the right to disobey federal law. Now, they were not quite that explicit in their argument, and there were, of course, things that were done to essentially kind of lessen the intensity of these resolutions. They didn't necessarily get through the Virginia and Kentucky state houses, but the message was sent that essentially, the federal government's power could be contested, and not just through the political system, but by a willing act of disobedience, nullification. This will be very important later on for the context of the Civil War, when effectively the South will nullify the election of Abraham Lincoln and decide that they can secede on that basis. Very dangerous stuff indeed. So what do we have by the time of the Adams administration in the 1790s? Well, we have the development of something that Washington said that he really abhorred, which was this notion of political parties. Washington's legacy was essentially to say that we should try and maintain a fierce neutrality in foreign affairs, hence the reason that he had kind of the mixed diplomacy of the Jay's Treaty and Pinckney's Treaty and other things during the 1790s. Of course, Adams tries to carry this through with the quasi-war with France, meaning that instead of going on to full war, he builds up a navy. He, of course, signs off on the Alien Sedition Acts, all in an effort to maintain this neutrality. Well, that becomes a contested issue, right? Because the steps taken to ensure that neutrality will be fought over politically. And then domestically, you have basically Hamilton's financial program with the National Bank at the center of it, as well as other issues like the whiskey tax, the assumption of state debts. All of this will seize the attention of folks like Jefferson and Madison, who are very much against Hamilton and the Federalists and believe that they are ruining the American Revolution by imitating the system of Great Britain. Obviously, Washington was not someone that could be touched. I mean, he was politically, he couldn't be touched. He was the father of the country. He was the first in war and the first in peace and the first in the hearts of his countrymen. His second term was a little rough, admittedly, and there were folks that came out against Washington in their own way, including Jefferson. But by and large, it wasn't until John Adams and we get the Alien Sedition Acts that the Federalists will be seen as going way too far in terms of their handling of federal power. And it is that is going to lead to, essentially, the Revolution of 1800, which, of course, will be the victory of Jefferson. Now, Jefferson did have a bit of a controversy in the election of 1800. We've all heard about it, I'm sure, in which he was effectively pitted against Aaron Burr, another Democratic Republican. And, of course, it will be Hamilton putting his support behind Jefferson as a Federalist, no less, that will allow him to become president. Hamilton's argument was simple. He said that Jefferson was a man of honor, but that Aaron Burr was not. This, of course, will really upset Aaron Burr, and you probably know how that story ends. Aaron Burr will kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel. in part over this issue and other things. But bottom line is, the Federalists had run their course in the 1790s. I mean, Aaron Burr was a Democratic Republican. Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. There was no doubt that a Democratic Republican was going to win the election of 1800. The Federalists had really spoiled their brand. While some had seen them as competent with the financial program of Alexander Hamilton, and others had appreciated maybe the disciplined diplomacy of Washington in dealing with Britain and France, by the time of Adams and the Alien Sedition Acts, folks were done with the Federalists having the kind of power that they had. They believed it to be unconstitutional. I mean, the Sedition Act seemed to be a direct repudiation of the First Amendment, the right to free speech. And so you have this revolution of 1800, and the question now becomes, and this is really what we'll be getting into next chapter, and that is, what will Jefferson bring? I mean, the Federalists were scared to death that Jefferson would perhaps kind of institute a witch hunt against them and try and weed them out. Of course, there were plenty of Democratic Republicans that were worried that the Federalists would not accept Jefferson as someone coming into the presidency. But what we do see in 1800, the Revolution of 1800, is we see the peaceful transfer from one political party to another in this country. And this really sets the standard for the rest of American history. I mean, with the exception of the Civil War, just about every political party that has won at the national level has been accepted by the American people. That doesn't mean supported, because obviously, people remain committed to their principles and don't necessarily support the party in power, but they acquiesce. They don't try to violently overthrow that power or resist that power. And that is a very important thing in American history. It's a tradition that we hope continues in our hyper-partisan times, that when another political party comes into power, that there is a peaceful transfer, even though there is a disciplined opposition. That seems to be the real lesson of the 1790s. This arguing over the founding, this arguing over the interpretation of the Constitution, this argument back and forth between political parties, that's all in the 1790s, and ultimately allows for a pretty substantial exchange of power from the Federalists who ruled the 1790s through Washington and Adams and Hamilton to the Democratic Republicans who will rule the beginning of the 19th century with Jefferson and Madison. And that will really be our story over the next few chapters, to take a look at how Democratic-Republican rule changes a little bit of the focus of the United States and ushers in kind of a new era in terms of our historical development. Thank you.